All right. Hello and welcome to lesson 2.1. This is video 2.1, events leading up to the Declaration of Independence. The lesson objective today, student will be able to summarize the key events and big ideas that led to the Declaration of Independence and identify the political forces that necessitated its writing. We also have a focus question. It's not depicted up here, but just listen. How did key events and key figures in American colonial history contribute to the writing of the Declaration of Independence? So we're now finally really digging into the beginnings of American government, right? We've spent all of Standard 1 talking about sort of the vague ideas that would eventually morph into American government, right? We talked about ancient Athens, ancient Rome, the Roman Republic. We talked about Locke and Rousseau, and Montesquieu as well. And then finally, we had a little brief discussion about what is American democracy? What does it consist of? What are the values of American democracy? Okay, so that's sort of the prelude. Now we're really digging into the actual origins, not the origins, the actual beginnings of American government. Okay. So permanent English settlement of North America begins, of course, in 1607 with the Jamestown colony in present-day North Carolina. It is interesting to note that 12 years later, in 1619, the Jamestown colonists would purchase 20 to 30 African slaves for their colony, who thus became the first African slaves in America, thereby ushering in the unique American history of slavery. Okay, so 1619 was actually the beginnings of American slavery. 1607 is when British settlement finally actually has a foothold on the North American continent. From Jamestown forward, the English steadily colonized up and down the North Atlantic coast, of North America. By the mid-18th century, British North America was a bustling, thriving colonial possession. Okay, so you'll see here the 13 original colonies. New Hampshire, you've got Massachusetts right here, Rhode Island, Connecticut, New York, okay, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Maryland. Virginia was just one big colony of Virginia. There was no such thing as West Virginia at that point. You have North Carolina, you have South Carolina, and then you have Georgia, okay, the southernmost British colony. Now, beginning in the mid-1700s, the British colonists had become accustomed to a policy of non-interference from British authorities in London. Only when it came to trade and/or foreign affairs did the king and Parliament have to actually intervene, have to step in. In 1760, however, when the infamous King George III ascended to the throne, this policy reversed. Now the British government would attempt a close control of its colonial possessions. Keep in mind, of course, that most colonists considered themselves loyal subjects of the British Crown. Regardless, members of Parliament thought that colonies were becoming simply too independent. In 1754, the British entered a costly contest with the French over the fertile Ohio River Valley. While the British would ultimately emerge triumphant, the war had forced Great Britain into tremendous debt, right? War debt. So to offset the costs of war and to ensure the ongoing defense of the colonists against bands of French and indigenous tribes, Parliament began to view the colonies as a greater source of tax revenue. In 1764, the famous Sugar Act was passed by Parliament, thereby imposing a series of taxes that were designed to pay off Britain's debt. This was followed by the 1765 Stamp Act, which taxed paper goods, so envelopes and whatnot. In response, the British colonists refused to purchase British-made goods and claimed that Parliament had no right to tax them without their consent. Seeking an outlet for their outrage, 9 of the 13 colonies send delegates, so these are representatives, a delegate is just the same thing as a representative, to a Stamp Act Congress in New York in October of 1765. Their goal was to write a united response to Parliament's tax. Remember, this is the Stamp Act. The result was a letter to the king declaring their loyalty to him, but their displeasure at being taxed by an authority from across the Atlantic Ocean. Instead, they claimed, only the specific colonial legislative assembly could tax them. While they were loyal to the king, they did not necessarily feel British, right? If you were in North Carolina, you felt North Carolinian. If you were in Georgia, you felt Georgian. You thought that only the Legislative Assembly of Georgia or only the Legislative Assembly of North Carolina had the right to tax you, okay? Parliament repealed the Stamp Act in 1766, but continued to pass new taxes that only fueled the colonists' outrage. Things were getting heated very, very quickly. And in fact, on March 5th, 1770, British soldiers, called Redcoats, fired into a crowd of protesting colonists in Boston, Massachusetts. They killed 5 people, including the fugitive slave Crispus Attucks, who is widely regarded as the first person to be killed in the Boston Massacre, and thus the first person to die for the American Revolution. In 1773, the British granted the East India Company the sole right to ship tea to the American colonies. Okay, they gave them a monopoly. In response, a group of Boston colonists, including John Adams, the future second president of the United States, staged the Boston Tea Party on December 16, 1773. Disguised as Native Americans, the colonists ran aboard the ships, which were filled with crates of tea. Okay, and they dumped the cargo overboard into the Boston harbor, hence the Boston Tea Party. King George was outraged at what he viewed as a horrible act of disrespect. Quote, "The colonies must either submit or triumph," he wrote. Parliament agreed with the king. In 1774, the Intolerable Acts were passed, which closed Boston Harbor, okay, meant that no ships could come in or out. They denied the colony of Massachusetts the right to govern itself. And finally, it made Boston families house British soldiers. We called this quartering. Okay, so they could quarter soldiers in the homes of Bostonians. The colonies worried that things were escalating too quickly. In hopes of a compromise between the colonies and Parliament, Virginia and Massachusetts suggested that a general meeting be held in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, with delegates from all 13 colonies. And so in the fall of 1774, all of the original 13 colonies, except Georgia, sent delegates to Philadelphia. As a result of the meeting, the delegates sent King George III a document called the Declaration of Resolves. The document demanded that the Intolerable Acts be repealed, that the British military no longer occupy colonies, and that the colonies be permitted to write their own tax laws. The British authorities, of course, rejected the Declaration of Resolves. And in April 1775, British redcoats clashed with colonial soldiers at Lexington and Concord in Massachusetts. This was the famous shot heard round the world. Okay, these were the first 2 conflicts of what would become the American Revolutionary War. Soon after the battles of Lexington and Concord, the Second Continental Congress met in Philadelphia, again in Philadelphia. As before, 12 representatives were present. The mood was somber. They knew they couldn't expect King George III to hear any more demands. They knew that action was required. So, as their first action, the Second Continental Congress organized the ragtag colonial soldiers around Boston into an official, formal Continental Army. The delegates unanimously voted George Washington to be commander-in-chief, who would of course eventually become our first president. With the Revolutionary War now begun, the Continental Congress was forced to assume the role of American government. Okay, they weren't necessarily independent of Great Britain, but they had to be their own government. Okay, it had no authority to do so. It had no authority to do so, but it was totally necessary. Okay, and throughout the Revolution, the Continental Congress would raise troops, borrow money, and send diplomats to Europe in search of military aid, okay? And also they would establish a monetary system, a system of money. But most importantly, as a self-declared government for the people of the American colonies, it would declare the colonies independent of Great Britain. Okay, that's the most important thing they did. They said, we don't care what you think, we don't care what you do, we are independent. We are declaring our independence. On January 10, 1776, a 47-page pamphlet appeared on the streets of Philadelphia. Written by the Englishman Thomas Paine, this pamphlet, Common Sense, would inspire support for American independence. In simple language, Paine argued that the colonies had to break with England. He said it was common sense to do so, and that everything could be blamed, particularly on the king. And in fact, he had a whole argument against monarchy to begin with. He argued that the colonies had a chance to, quote, begin the world again, and he envisioned a new world that would embrace democracy. Okay, remember, rule by the people. On June 7th, 1776, the Virginia delegate, Richard Henry Lee, so he was representing the colony of Virginia, stood before his colleagues and said that the Continental Congress needed to pass a resolution that would officially declare the colony's independence from Britain. By this point, the Revolutionary War was already many months in. Congress appointed a group of men to oversee the declaration. Thomas Jefferson, who was known for his writing ability, ended up writing most of the document. In his Declaration of Independence, Jefferson draws heavily from two big ideas from John Locke. First, the idea of natural rights, including life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Two, the idea of a social contract that exists between people and their government. As he argues, government gets their power from the consent of the governed. If the government ignores the will of the people, then the people have the right to change that government. And that's exactly what he was saying. Okay? And this would ultimately become the most radical idea of the 18th century, right? That if the government is not doing what it needs to do, if it's not fulfilling its duty to the people, then it needs to be changed. If with force, if necessary. All right, that's the key. With force, if necessary. Finally, on July 4th, 1776, the Continental Congress approved the Declaration of Independence, and this is why we consider July 4th the birthday of our nation. It was the day we declared ourselves free from Britain. Okay, so I apologize. I did not skip forward when I was supposed to, so I apologize about that. So I'll leave this up. This is the slide on the Declaration of Independence details, the two ideas from John Locke. And then finally, excuse me, this is the end of the video. Again, I apologize about that. So again, this is why we consider July 4th the birthday of our nation. It was the day we declared ourselves free from Britain. Okay, so I hope you enjoyed this, and I will see you in the next video.